listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, I had the opportunity to interview David Rothman. David is the author of Lelya Dorche in the Coney Island Cure, a fictional book set during the uncontrolled phase of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm here with David Rothman, who is the author of Lelya Dorche and the Coney Island Cure. David, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure. I'm a professor of English at the City University of New York, and this is my first novel. I had a novella, award-winning novella, come out in the heart of COVID in 2020. And before that, I had some short stories published in a number of journals. And I'm excited to have this novel come out this summer. And it's great to be on different podcasts and, getting book reviews and all that. So I really appreciate it.
Without spoiling too much of your book, what is Lelya Dorche and the Coney Island Cure about?
Well, it's a survival novel. We go back to the early days of COVID, and a lot of people forget how harsh they were because there have been so many stages of this pandemic, and the feeling is sort of diluted now because we have a vaccine and not many people are dying anymore. But in the early days, it was really horrible, particularly here in Queens, New York. My area was labeled nationally as the epicenter of the epicenter. So New York City at one point was the epicenter, and my neighborhood was the epicenter of the epicenter. So here we have a novel where a father has a son. His 13-year-old son has a very severe form of asthma, what was then known as a pretty severe underlying condition when COVID first started. And he's very fearful for his son, and his son gets the virus. And as you know, there was no vaccine, there was no really medicine, there was nothing really anyone could offer at that point in time. And so we're now set on our journey, right? The father wants to protect his son. And then we add a little magic because I like to add magic to a story. It's a magical realism genre here. And he finds out through a contact that there's this old woman, sort of an ancient Bulgarian natural healer named Lelya Dorche, who is using her sort of natural healing remedy on people in the area, in the neighborhood called Coney Island on the Atlantic shore. And he wants to get some of that because, his son is really endangered. And so he makes a deal kind of with the devil, but she's not a devil. She wants him to get her more supplies of the key ingredient for her remedy, which is Macedonian pine sap, which can only be found in the northwest corner of Bulgaria near the Danube River. He can't get there because all flights have been canceled. Passenger flights, as you know, in the early days you couldn't fly overseas. So he has to find a way to get to this area of Bulgaria and get Lelya Dorche what she wants. Otherwise, she will not treat his son. And so it's a real adventure. And the reader is, in for a good ride.
Is your book self-published or traditionally published?
Yeah, that's always a good question. It's not self-published. It is with a really wonderful publisher down in Dallas, the great state of Texas, Dallas, Texas, Madville Publishing, which is a really, really nice, indie press. They put out about 24 novels a year. And, for those of you out there, it is really competitive. I'm sure all the writers listening know that. It's hard. It's pretty hard. I had an earlier novel some years back that almost got picked up by Little Brown, which is one of the big five. If you get that one, it's like winning the lottery. And I just missed with that one. It was so close. And this was a lot easier. I already had a little bit of a name. I had won an award for my novella. That helped. I had some, short fiction published, as I mentioned earlier. That helped. And so, I got lucky, I guess you could say, with this wonderful publisher down in Texas. And they have just been, great. Shout out to Madville Publishing.
As this interview is being recorded, we are around 3.5 years removed from the start of the COVID-19 lockdowns here in the United States. Why would readers want to read a book based on a real-life pandemic whose uncontrolled phase is recent history?
Well, that is an excellent question. This is a really good interview. I appreciate that, a question like that. I've been thinking about that a lot. You know what I say, I just did a big book reading we had about 40 people there, and someone asked a question like that, and I was ready for it because it's a good one. You know, this was a hell of a pandemic, and you know what they say about history needs you need a little distance sometimes, right? So, you know, in the first year or two, we were just dealing with the pandemic. You're not going to be reading about the pandemic because you're like running away from people. But it's not funny actually. But I think it's time. You know, 3 years down the road from the really dangerous days of COVID, we're 3 years from that. It's time, I think, we roll down the windows, look out, and say, what the heck went on here? And you can notice it. You know, it's starting to happen. There's some, you know, bigger name writers coming out with COVID novels. Michael Cunningham has one coming out, I think, in a week or two. Gary Steingart had one out about 9 months ago, I believe. Kathleen Shine has a classic, Kunstler in Paradise, about a boy who visits his grandmother in Santa Monica and then gets stuck because of COVID, can't leave. But it's a good thing because he bonds with his grandmother. That's a good book. You know, there's a lot happening now. And I think it's because people are like, you know what? We feel a lot safer. We have a vaccine. If you get it these days, more, you know, 95%, you're not going to have like a serious case, although my heart goes out to those still suffering. But, you know, it's 3 years down the line, and it's about that time that we we open up the windows, say, you know, we got to think about what went on here.
Would you describe your book as plot-driven, character-driven, or somewhere in between?
Wow, that is a great question. I would say that it's plot-driven in the sense that we really get to know the main character, who's his father, who's so worried about his son, and we get to know the son well, and we get to know Lelya Dorche well. So it's certainly plot-driven, but I mean character-driven that way. We get to know this family. At the same time, I would argue it's even more so. It's more plot-driven because it's a nail biter. It's a nail biter. What's going to happen to this kid? You know, he has COVID. How's his father going to do this? You know, and it's really riveting in that sense.
How did you go about balancing the realistic and the magical in your narrative?
Oh, God. Someone's done their homework. These are great questions. You know, magical realism demands that we suspend our sense of reality, and we're willing to sort of, you know, transcend reality and go into this other sphere. It's almost like a science fiction sphere. And at the same time, the writer's job is to make most of the story as realistic as possible to keep us in that real world. But we also, there's sort of a wink, right? Because we know, wait a minute. This sounds real, but you have a 108-year-old natural healer from Bulgaria walking around in Coney Island who's been dealing with pandemics, COVID, of course, Ebola, bird flu, SARS, AIDS, since 1950 something. How could that be, right? You have to suspend belief. So you know, there's a fine line. It's kind of hard to do. But you know, I did not want to write a document about COVID. And like, you know, harking back to what you sort of said a few moments ago, nobody wants to read that. You know, if you want to read that, then just go online and, you know, open up I don't know, whatever, CNN or Fox News, whatever you like, and go on there, or newspaper, and go, you know, type in, you know, COVID articles from April 2020, and you can read about all the death and devastation and fear. I don't want to write a novel like that. This is not a document. But, you know, at the same time, it's partially a document because it takes you back there. And you really feel that the readers, I've gotten a lot of feedback from readers around New York City and a couple readers in Spain as well, who told me that they it really took them back to those hardy days. But at the same time, there's a lightness, right? Because it's, there's magic involved in the sense that this natural healer is doing this. And Coney Island has always been, at least in New York, has always been a sort of symbol of something magical going on the shores of the Atlantic. So I thought that was a good place to set a magical story.
Do you plan on writing more books?
Oh, always, yeah. I mean, the funny thing, and I was talking to some writers the other night because I'm in a writing group with some writers here in the city. Everyone has stuff in their closet, and everyone has stuff that's fresh on their laptops. You just have to kind of figure out what to do next, because it just seems like sometimes life is about timing. So, I have a novel that I mentioned earlier. I think in some ways it's as strong or stronger than this one, but I went for the stars. I went for the top publishers, and I went for the NFL or the NBA, and I almost got signed. Like it's one of those players that almost gets signed but doesn't get signed. So I'm thinking, you know what? I'm going to look at that novel. I've been looking at that novel actually recently. I'm like, this is pretty good. I can improve on this, and maybe I can get this published. So I have that, and then I have some new work that I've been sort of like thumbing around with. So certainly, you got to keep writing.
You are also a writing instructor at the City University of New York. What is your favorite aspect of being a writing instructor at CUNY?
Well, I would say, trying to reach the challenge or meet the challenge of sparking a light, in my students' minds about writing, because so many students come in. I have a lot of students who are 18, 19. They come in with, after having some perhaps negative experiences in public school with writing. They're intimidated. They lack confidence in the skill, and it's like pulling teeth for some of them. And I just try to engage them in a way that they get excited about a topic. It's sort of like the trick of the light, right? They say, well, I don't like writing. But it's like, all right, you don't like writing. That's okay. And I don't like reading either. That's okay. All right, you don't like reading. But what about this? What about this crazy thing that happened with that? There was a documentary, I forget the name, about a Native American basketball player that made it off the res and made it big, and then ended up getting arrested for domestic violence. So we were reading about her, and then we were watching a documentary about her. And boy, everybody cared about that, pulled at your heartstrings. I said, all right, well, let's write about that. Everybody wanted to write about it because they all were like competing with their, they wanted to share their perspectives and, competing in terms of trying to win the point about who's right and who's wrong about what went down with this basketball player. So it's kind of a trick of the light, because then after the end of the day, he said, you know what? You just did some great writing on this topic, and you seem to enjoy it. And they're like, oh, yeah, I guess that's writing. And so that for me is the greatest reward. If you can get non-writers to feel at least, lukewarm or better, at least, about writing, that to overcome their fear, to overcome this inhibition, and to sort of like perhaps rearrange their mindset about where they fit in the writing world.
David Rothman, you are a wonderful guest for this podcast, and I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast.
Well, I thank you, and I have to say I've done a few podcasts, and this has been really, in many ways, the most impressive in terms of the quality of the questions and just the engagement.
David was a wonderful guest to interview. Before I end this episode, I have a major announcement to make. Earlier today, on the day this episode was uploaded, I deactivated my social media accounts on X, formerly known and still commonly referred to as Twitter. I have used Twitter for over a decade from several different accounts over the years, but Twitter, in ways that most other social media platforms are not, is simply too taxing on my mental health for me to continue using that platform. I'll still be on numerous online platforms in varying capacities, including my author website, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Reddit, Mastodon, Post, Tribal, Tumblr, Buy Me a Coffee, Ko-Fi, Substack, YouTube, and of course, this podcast going forward. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at authoraac and on Instagram at aacscribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.